All right, this week we're going to focus on the design element line. So just a little background, I'm going to define a lot of terms in this lecture and in our continuing lectures, and I just want to let you guys know that they're from the book Design Basics. All right, line, to set a point in motion. The only dimension is length and sometimes width. So the example that we have here on the right is a light drawing by Pablo Picasso from 1949. And I chose this example because it's kind of a 2D example, it's kind of a 3D example. But basically what it is it's Pablo Picasso took a photography camera, and he opened the shutter speed for a long time, and then he kind of drew with like a light this vase and flowers. And so we're actually able to see that it literally is a point that's set in motion in this space right in front of him that then creates this image. So beautiful example there. All right, line conveys mood. Line has the power of suggestion. Line quality is defined as any number of characteristics of line determined by its weight, direction, uniformity, or other features. So in this drawing we see on the right by Anna Werwein called Porch Sitters, we see there are a whole bunch of figures. They're squeezed around this little table. They're bundled up. They must be sitting on a porch outside somewhere. But we can see like in the pant legs, the color almost looks watered down. In other parts, the color is, or the line of the pencil is like very sketchy, like in the blanket up there. And what that kind of gives us is this feeling of a lot of energy. So they're sitting around at night. We can hear them talking over each other. Maybe they're dropping their wine glasses. They're moving around a lot. But there's kind of this clamorous energy squeezing in and pulsing out of these people. And we get that feeling or that emotion or mood from the type of line that's being drawn within these figures. All right, some other examples of line quality in three-dimensional forms is on the left we have Richard Serra's Inside Out. So this is a huge steel sculpture, and we know it's huge because we can see that tiny little figure showing us the scale of the piece. So these are steel pieces that are actually made in shipyards because that's the only type of tools that we've developed that can handle this size of steel. So what makes this piece interesting is the edge of that. So it almost looks like a ribbon that's been dropped on the floor, something really delicate and soft and smooth and curvy. And that line quality makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel like there's this flow, this ease to it. But if that steel piece was really jagged, or if there were sharp edges, we would feel a little bit like scared of walking in between it, or maybe nervous around it. But because it's so smooth and free, that edge of that line, we feel a little bit more comfortable with it. Now on this piece on the right called Spiral Jetty, which is an earthwork by Robert Smithson, you can actually visit this piece. It's on this salt flat, and so what the artist did was they gathered stones and placed them out, reaching out into this salt flat, and you can see this spiral. Now, the line quality in the spiral is kind of whimsical. It's not exactly like totally carefree because it is controlled, but there's definitely kind of like a fluidity to it. It looks like a lollipop or a snail or something kind of silly. And we see that the edge of that lake is kind of curvy too. There's a lot of repeating forms in the landscape that there are in the piece as well. So it's somewhat natural, but it's very bold and defined. So that line quality makes us notice it, but it also doesn't make it feel totally out of the ordinary, but it's definitely a spectacle, something to notice. So two examples of three-dimensional line quality. Contour line is a line used to follow the edges of a form and thus describe their outlines. So in this drawing by Henry Matisse, we see a woman in front of a bird cage. She's maybe on a couch or a chair, and there's maybe some trees outside. So we can discern all these different things by just a simple line. So her body is just one edge, the outer edge of her body. We can see the hair is almost one line. It's just the outer edge of her hair. So a contour line is just defining the outer edge of the form using as few lines as possible with still getting as much information. Okay, an example of a three-dimensional contour line is this piece by Devin Ballara called Log Jam. So in this we see these kind of cylindrical, spherical pieces. They're all stacked on top of each other and overlapping. But in the image from the side, we can see that it's very flat. And in fact, it's just these simple forms in steel that kind of exist in this space. So they give us this idea of this log jam, but in reality, it's just very few lines. No texture, no volume, just the outlines of the form. Another three-dimensional example of contour line is this piece by Daniel, these two pieces by Daniel Cummings. And for me, when I look at the image on the right and we see that woman in there for scale, we can tell that it's a room, that it's in space, but these lines are so simple and they define such a simple form, they almost look two-dimensional, like they could be just a simple little sketch on a piece of paper. But in fact, they take up the whole room. So these are more abstract images, unlike logjam, where we can see it represents something that exists in the natural world. These are very abstract. But they still create just a really simple outline of a form. Cross contour is a line that appears to wrap around a form in a pattern that is at an angle to the outline of the form. So a really good two-dimensional example of this is a topographical map. So we can see what would be these mountains and kind of the height of them based on these shapes and how they kind of define the outside of the form and wrap around it. A three-dimensional example of that is this piece called Rocky Creek by Deborah Butterfield. So it looks like these are, like wood that you would find on a beach, driftwood, but they're actually cast bronze. But what it is it's this horse, and we are able to see the horse by all these stacking sticks that come over the form and then begin to develop a sort of volume. So as the lines cross over each other and start to kind of wrap around the form, this is the kind of an example of cross contour and how we're able to create volume and depth with just line. All right, a manner of making line drawings is called gesture. Gesture is a line that does not stay at the edges but moves freely within forms. These lines record movement of the eye as well as implying motion of the form. So in this drawing by Alberto Giacometti, I see a woman, she's sitting there, and there is some lines that just define the outside, like the outside of her legs. But then when we move up into her belly, we can see that the line actually starts to move through her belly, and it's not just defining the outside, but it's giving us volume and weight. And it's kind of a sketchier line. There's more movement in it, and you can almost see the artist as his eye moves up the figure and down it, and how he's starting to kind of flush out all these sort of spaces and volumes and shadows through just line. So that's a good example of gesture. Really quick, really spontaneous, just drawing what you see kind of in the movement and getting as much information as possible quickly. All right, so this is an example of gesture in sculpture, and this is kind of a funny example. This is a piece that was made by Corinna Ray, who's a good friend of mine. This is called Her Ballet, and so how this worked was Corinna set up this little staging area with a couple of these benches and ladders situation, and we all picked prompts out of a bowl, and then we had to kind of spontaneously describe them. So one of them was like, create a chain link fence between you and your partner. Create a interwoven knot. So there were kind of all these things that are hard to do with your body, and we all had to just try our best to kind of create these movements in just a spontaneous sort of a form. So we create these three-dimensional shapes and forms, but they were really just sort of a quick gesture in the moment to kind of get the feeling out without necessarily getting out all the perfect information and describing it exactly. Implied and psychic lines. Implied line is an invisible line created by positioning a series of points so that the eye will connect them and thus create a movement across the picture plane. So in this three-dimensional example, we see the artist has created this kind of doorway out of steel, and basically what we see is there's all these kind of little hanging pieces, and at the ends of them there's these little pink tips, and I always pictured those pink tips as being like fingernails that are kind of pointing to other parts of the sculpture. So each end of that line is creating an implied invisible line pointing to another part of the sculpture. So just a kind of fun example to think about implied line. Here's an example of psychic line, which is a mental connection between 2 points or elements. This occurs when a figure is pointing or looking in a certain direction, which causes the eye to follow toward the intended focus. So psychic line has to do with figures within a space. This is a painting by Alison Bickel called Three Fates. So on the right-hand side, we see a figure, and she's looking directly out at us. Her gaze is coming out of the picture plane and into our world. The figure in the middle is looking down at the figure bending below. And the figure bending low, if she wasn't covering her eyes, she'd be looking out directly at the top of the painting. So on the right and the left, we both have these figures who are kind of transcending the picture plane. One of them is coming right at us, one of them could be coming out of the top, and then there's another figure who's looking down. So all of these lines, all of these gazes that are happening are all psychic lines. They're not really a line that's there, but we can see them and follow them and imagine where they'd be going. All right, to just slow down for a second and talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of lines and how they kind of feel in a sculpture. So a horizontal line implies quiet and repose like a body at rest. Horizontal refers to the horizon as a reference for level line and stability in architecture. So when we think of something, I love to relate the body to lines. So when you're horizontal, you are asleep or calm or relaxing or laying. All right, a vertical line is like a standing body. It has more potential for activity, but it's still pretty stable. It's not necessarily moving. So again, reference the body there. Now, a diagonal line is the most strongly suggesting motion. The leaning angle indicates movement. So if your body's at an angle, you're going to start running or you're about to jump or you're moving, there's some sort of implied movement. You can't generally maintain a diagonal line in your body for very long. So just a quick, important way to think about the movement in lines and what they kind of mean. All right, line can be used to create value. By varying the number of lines and their proximity, the artist can produce an almost limitless number of grays. This is known as hatching and cross-hatching. So in these drawings by Sophia Palma, these were made at a music festival in Berlin, and they were drawn live, so as the musician is recording. So hatching is when you kind of draw a line in the same direction, and cross-hatching is when you cross lines over each other. So not only are the values getting richer, meaning that we have more differentiation between light and dark in these drawings, but there's also a lot of movement. There's like complexity and texture that we see in these drawings that there wouldn't be if they were just a contour drawing. We wouldn't feel as much value, but also movement. Here is an example of value through hatching and cross-hatching in a three-dimensional work. So this is Boer by Martin Purrier. And on the right-hand side, we can see as the piece kind of comes together, there's more value. It's a little bit, the wood is coming together and creating a richer tone. And on the left side, where the wood spreads out, there's less value. It seems to me not as dense and as dark. So as the lines build up, they can kind of create mass or solidness or airiness within them. All right, so that's just a few examples of line. We'll talk about more of them as we go on.